Welcome, everyone. Welcome to 313 on Gramsci, Sartre, and the Engaged Philosopher. It's a privilege to welcome back our dear friend and colleague at Columbia, Étienne Balibar. Étienne, feel free to join us from Paris. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Étienne, you personify the engaged or worldly philosopher, and so it's really stunning to be able to engage you on these very questions. Étienne Balibar, as you all know, is the author of numerous brilliant, engaged philosophical and political works over the decades, from the seminal 1965 Reading Capital with Louis Althusser, Pierre Macheret, and Jacques Rancière, of course, a text that itself we could be studying as a work in engaged philosophy or worldly philosophy that we could interrogate from the perspective of the problematic of this seminar. Of course, to other books, Race, Nation, Class with Emmanuel Wallerstein, We the People of Europe, Equal Liberty, and another work, Libre Parole, which I refer to in my introductory blog because it's there that Étienne Balibar develops the concept of the singular intellectual by contrast to the universal or the specific intellectual. Étienne has been one of our most faithful and constant companions on these 1313s. In fact, we used to plan our seminars together so that they would enrich each other and sit in each other's seminars. And I greatly miss that because of the pandemic. We're so sad you're not here physically with us, Étienne, but we're so delighted that you can join us from Paris for this conversation. So we come to this conversation perhaps from slightly different perspectives, Étienne. So we'll have to figure this out as we move along. We've been working in this seminar, starting with the Biodun Jeyifo's intervention, and then Adon Getachew. We've been looking at texts of what we've been calling revolutionary or worldly philosophers. And examples would be Frantz Fanon or Kwame Nkrumah, who we've been reading over the past few sessions. And of course, Fanon here is a particularly interesting thinker to think with, in part because of Sartre's preface to The Wretched of the Earth, which then positions Sartre in a slightly different position, fitting somewhere between the worldly revolutionary philosopher like Fanon, but not in the academy. Almost in the academy, could have been in the academy, was almost in the academy, but not in the sense that he resisted that temptation always, importantly. And so part of our question today could be the question of what is the difference between Fanon's theoretical practical interventions and Sartre's practical interventions. Perhaps what is the difference between The Wretched of the Earth and the preface, right? And in a way, Sartre plays a different role. He engages philosophy in a different way. He's trying to do something to philosophy, for instance, in Critique de la Raison Dialectique, right? The massive opus. I mean, it's an effort to do something to philosophy, to transform from an existentialist perspective, Marxism, but a different exercise, it feels, than Fanon's work, philosophical work, in a revolutionary text like Wretched of the Earth. And the role that Sartre plays in many of these texts as engaged philosopher making political interventions in cultural domains like literature, theater, poetry, is different. You can feel it in the work, in the présentation of Les Temps modernes, right? The way, the political engagement, and I try to describe this and to set it out in my introductory post so that everybody has a sense of the notion of this engagement. It was the word engaged, engagé, was so important for Sartre. He wrote of a littérature engagée, right? He urged everyone to engage not only in literature, but in whatever form they were taking. Abstention, he writes, is a choice, right? and the human being must be totally engaged to be totally free. There was no choice about this. You feel it in Les Temps Modernes. You feel it in his work, in the Black Orpheus that we read as well. And so, what I was trying to propose in the second essay to set the stage for this conversation was that the role of the engaged philosopher draws its potential. It almost has its condition of possibility in the Gramscian idea, or at least our common interpretation of the Gramscian idea of hegemony, of cultural hegemony. It's only when culture, mentalities, and we use different terms when we come to this from different traditions, ideologies, regimes of truth. It's always when these mentalities come to the fore that there is more work for cultural production. It's then that cultural work becomes more important. And so the question that I ask, and it's kind of to frame this conversation, is whether that approach, and thus the engaged philosopher, is somewhat vulnerable to political relations of power. So what if the cultural changes can play too easily into the hands of others? And so I was proposing that we could think of Lenin in this context and his writings on cooperation, the relationship between the political revolutionary change and its relationship to what he called cultural revolution. We could also think about it, as I proposed, through the work of Luc Boltanski and Eve Chiapello, the remarkable book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, the way in which cultural transformation gets co-opted. And perhaps that's an example of a situation where there wasn't enough political change in order to allow for the cultural change to work in a productive manner. But in any event, I think that sets up at least our seminar and our conversation on Gramsci and Sartre and the engaged philosopher, setting up in part the important question of whether we are in fact dealing with a different form of theory and praxis when we engage what we are calling here the engaged philosopher. All right, so I hope that is a good framework to allow us to have a really rich conversation about this. And I'm delighted, again, Étienne, that you're going to be the one who kicks us off. So thank you so much for being here. And please do get us going. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you for saying all this, for reminding me and us that I had been involved in the activities of this seminar since the beginning. So I feel like something like a founding participant, perhaps we could say. And let me say in passing that this seminar has been extremely fruitful and important and challenging and helpful to me in my work. But I also hear around that this has been the case for many other people in different places and different countries. So it's my enormous pleasure to be back with you, although from afar. Incidentally, there's a little technical problem. I hope that everybody can see me, but I see myself in the on the screen. And again, I have this problem, which is that I can't. Excuse me.
Yes, everybody sees you perfectly and hears you perfectly.
Okay. But, and I lament that. I can't look at you in the eyes, really, or I should do that. This is because my little device here is like that. I have webcam, which is above my monitor, and I have my notes and my text below, so I can't at the same time read and look at you, which is terrible. I dislike that. Okay, so thank you for your introduction. Needless to say, the text that you posted on the website have been extremely helpful and also challenging in a sense to me. So I'm largely reacting to them, but I also had some ideas before. We already discussed Gramsci a little bit and even Sartre in the preparation of this seminar. So I had Anne Sola says, of course. I don't know what she means, but she
no, we're all gonna. Yeah, we're all going to turn on our videos when you're
it's okay. It's
presenting.
Okay. So Bernard, yesterday night when we corresponded about that, you said to me that you would grant me for this first presentation 30 minutes, which should not become more than 40. And that's more or less what you said. Yes. Okay, so I'll try and remain within this framework. And at the end, if necessary, you'll cut me. Okay, I have a few preliminary considerations as always, which hopefully don't eat the whole thing. The first thing I want to say very quickly is about why I need to speak in the first person. And this is not because I am an important case in the history of engagement. I would want to give my own case as a model, se donner un exemple, we would say in French. But it's simply because I realized, and I hope you'll agree with that, that you cannot talk about engagement or engagement, it would come to the question of terminology, without precisely engaging, that is involving, committing, implicating, risking yourself into the matter. The second thing I want to say at the beginning is the following. We are certainly discussing a general problem. And this problem, say the problem of the function, the role, and as a consequence, also the, let's say the historical, symbolic, cultural figure of the intellectual or its different, his or her different figures, is part of the question that you chose as a subject or main guiding thread for this year's seminar, the question of worldly philosophers. This perhaps we can come back to that, but the name itself is very interesting and intriguing to me. It's a theological, sociological, political category. Remember that in Marx, for example, the strong opposition in the thesis on Feuerbach is between worldly and otherworldly, and Diesseitigkeit, Jenseitigkeit. And of course, it's also interesting to remember Arendt's consideration on what is worldly and what she calls acosmism. I mean, but the main reference for me here, of course, is Max Weber, because of his notion of the inner worldly asceticism, inner weltliche Askese, which he develops in the field of theology and also, in fact, politics, when he refers to the Protestant ethics and so on. And I believe we are still in the continuity of that. Now, to this question, we I think that we cannot answer with showing or enumerating types, I would say, of intellectuals. So this is insufficient. We must come to the singular cases, and these singular cases, which, when they are important, they are different, and they're never exactly the same. They, of course, are attached to names. And as a consequence, there is almost a necessity, but also, of course, a danger to fill a presentation like my presentation today with many, many names. I have tried to be a little careful, but I can't avoid that completely. And with the names, of course, come the circumstances. What we might call the hazards of the somewhere between the Machiavellian Fortuna and I'll come back to that, some certain tragedies and catastrophes of history, which pushed, in a sense, some of the worldly intellectuals we want to talk about to reach the extremities and the apex of, I would say, of their commitments and possibilities. Now, with this consideration comes another idea which I absolutely want to introduce, and I don't say that you seem to forget that, but perhaps there's a little challenge there, which, namely, I understand why you are essentially interested in revolutionaries, people on the side of justice, and I'll come back to that. But engaged intellectuals are on every side. And therefore, one of the questions for which I don't have a simple answer is, does engagement essentially differ depending on which side you commit yourself to? Or if you prefer, which party you choose or you rally in the narrow sense of party organization, or in a broader sense. Of course, this immediately also, and I hope to be able to come to that in a slightly different manner at the end, raises the issue, why so many intellectuals, in the broad sense, in the course of their lives and their intellectual activities, shift from one side or one party to another. And the question is all the more important because sometimes, and we have examples in mind, if we don't adopt a narrow definition of what party, or purely organizational definition of party, what party means, if we attach, I'd say, the party, the idea of the party to a certain understanding of the cause. So what we need to realize, of course, is that it is in fact the party which has changed side in the back sometime of your consciousness, as Hegel would say. And this, especially in the last century, of course, has to do with the tragic history of that century, what Eric Hobsbawm called the century of extreme. So you're a member of the Communist Party, for example, and this commits you to certain ideals of justice and certain militant activities, and you believe you're still on the same side of history. But the fact is that during that period, perhaps the party has itself changed side in the in its ethical and political meaning, which is more or less what happened to Gramsci. But I'll come to that. Now, the criteria are never obvious. And this is, and perhaps there is even a deep intrinsic ambivalence there, which is one of the reasons why I absolutely wanted Max Weber to be included alongside Gramsci in the reading list. And it's also one of the reasons, another reference I could have given, why I recommend the lecture in particular of the chapter on Heidegger and Lukács in Slavoj Žižek's In Defense of Lost Causes, where he argues that Heidegger was absolutely right to choose the extreme, accept an extreme position, except that he chose the wrong one. But that's, in a sense, only a contingency. Now, back to my personal case, if I dare. I was asking myself, which parties did I rally or belong to in my life, and did I change side one way or another? And of course, that it's a very contingent example. But I said to myself, okay, between 1961 and 1981, I was a member with a member card of the French Communist Party until I had to leave it. And now I use the party, for example, in recent publications in reference to Altiero Spinelli's Manifesto di Ventotene to designate the Party of Europe. So I present myself as a member, a virtual member of the Party of Europe. And I absolutely understand that some people would say, oh, Balibar has moved a long way to the other side. He was a communist and now he's European federalist. Of course, the continuity between them, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that we are in a different conjuncture. The Party of Europe is not the only one that I would like to defend. And my specific reason is that I believe that we face again a choice between fascism and anti-fascism in Europe, and the Party of Europe is on one side and not the other. But then, of course, comes the question of the causes, les causes, we'd say in French here, that you defend. And here again, the questions of names are very important. When I was a young man, my Maoist friends were continuously quoting Chairman Mao's idea that one should side with the people, and they had called their journal La Cause du Peuple. So this people, the cause of the people, was a kind of code name for the proletariat. And I always thought that there was something problematic in the idea that you are on the side, on the defending the cause of the people. On the other hand, in his two preliminary papers, Bernard says something which touches me very deeply, and I'll return to that in different manner. He almost says, let's say almost says, I'm ready to sacrifice the intellectual and particularly the academic dimension of my activities, to sacrifice the intelligence, because the one thing that is important for me is the cause of justice. And of course, we are, many of us believe, and very sincerely, that we put the cause of justice above everything. Then the question becomes, of course, does it call for a sacrifice of that kind, or are there circumstances in which this could be the case? And finally, I know this is a little too long, but I thought I need that. Another formula comes to my mind, which is the one that Jacques Rancière used already a long time ago. And this was not any circumstance. This was in the 1990s. We were both participating in a conference with Algerian colleagues, or we were supposed to participate with Algerian colleagues, except that the civil war had broken out in Algeria at the time, and therefore they couldn't leave their country, which was also a very perilous situation. So we were in the strange situation of doing a Franco-Algerian, French-Algerian conference with only French participants, which perhaps is revealing of some dissymmetries in our world. But of course, what was essentially present to our mind was a kind of retrospective consideration of what the anti-imperialist commitments of our youth had meant, and what kind of consequences they would entail in the present. And Jacques Rancière coined that was the title of his paper, coined or used the beautiful expression, la cause de l'autre. He said this was a moment for French, the cause of the other, in which French students and others and also militants, workers, etc., took part, for example, in demonstrations, fought against the police, and so on, not in the name of their own emancipatory cause, but in the name of the emancipation of the other, which was the decisive element. And I think that beyond the question of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, this touches an extremely important issue, but also, of course, a difficult one, because the cause of justice is defined in abstract terms, but the other is never an abstract, an abstraction. And to anticipate, and I come to that now, when Sartre, in the examples that you give, of course, he perfectly illustrates that. I mean, even before the preface to The Wretched of the Earth. And the preface to The Wretched of the Earth almost exactly literally says something like, I am in this text fighting for the other, provided this other, of course, is not this other's voice, does not become something like an appendix of my own voice. Okay, so now I have to, hope I still have a little bit of time, to say case discussions, case studies, and they are not difficult to anticipate because you set the stage for that. First Sartre and second Gramsci. Now, very summarily, what do I want to say about engagement as coined by Sartre? I want to say first that in the text that you quoted and that are offered as readings for our seminar, plus others, but you already included a long series of them, texts on negritude, etc. Perhaps, in fact, in every text that Sartre has written in this, that has been collected in this series called in French Situation, with 9 or 10 volumes, which collect all his interventions in the fields of politics, culture, and so on. And which some of which are extremely bad, but some others are really beautiful. I'm not far from thinking that they, in a sense, provided Sartre with the occasion of finding his best style. So illustrated by his own, in a sense, activity, he coined a concept, engagement or littérature engagée, which has two remarkable properties, I believe. First, it soon, quickly, and vastly surpassed or dépassé, overcame its initial meaning and the circumstances in which it had been coined, which in particular means that it did not remain only applicable to literature, or art, if you prefer, even in a broad sense. And I don't say that you reduce it to that, but I want to insist on this point. Or it opens the gates, the borders between literature, even in a broad sense, and every other sort of intellectual activity or writing. And the second characteristic is that this text, this name, engagement, remains in some sense untranslatable, but understandable in other languages, at least neighboring languages, which means that it's been imported, like others we could mention. Of course, here I bitterly feel the limitation of my knowledge and acquaintance, because of course I'm sure that in India or in Africa, because of the use of the European language as an instrument of communication, you can say engagement, but I don't know what you would say in Chinese, for example, and that would be okay. So let me mention in passing an extremely interesting testimony. Perhaps some of you know that in 1962, Adorno published in German a rather lengthy critical essay, very critical of Sartre, in fact, and also critical of Brecht, which is called Engagement in the German text and the German publication. Now, of course, German has a possibility, which is to very easily, especially in the theoretical field, adopt or naturalize French terminology. So engagement sounds like French in the title, but then in the course of the essay, it becomes engagierte littérature, which is very funny. And now the funniest of all, I believe, is the fact that the English translation, which you'll easily find on the internet, is titled Commitment. But commitment is a partial equivalent for engagement, but it's far from retaining, I would say, all the dimensions of this notion. So to come to it, the key to this idiomatic singularity lies in, of course, the question of responsibility. And as Bernard has beautifully explained in his presentation, the other side of responsibility, that is irresponsibility, as another form of responsibility, or if you prefer, the great theme in Sartre, that the writers who claim or believe to be apolitical are in fact deeply political in a practical sense. And if you read Sartre's text, so I believe to see that you have posted for the seminar the excerpts from Sartre, Présentation des temps modernes, and Situation in the French version. I don't know if, did you?
Also, yes, yeah, also in English. Yeah.
Okay, so we will assume that everybody can read at least a little bit of that, and I'll rely on that. So the base, of course, on the foundation for this discussion of responsibility lies in the coupling of two words or notions, which are embarquer, être dans le coup, you comment that, to be on board, or to be in the boat, so to speak, and choisir, to choose. And of course, what Sartre explains, I simplify perhaps, is that the situation is never chosen. The situation in which, or the conditions in which you think and act, but within this absence of choice or the possibility of choice, there nevertheless a clear unity of opposites. There's an absolute or a radical possibility of choosing. Now, the key sentence from that point of view in Sartre's text, forgive me because I am looking for it, it is here. The key sentence, and I will read from the French, if you allow me, skipping some passages, is the following. Totalement conditionné par sa classe, being completely or absolutely determined or conditioned by his or her class membership, sa classe, son salaire, la nature de son travail, conditionné jusqu'à ses sentiments, determined even in his or her feelings, jusqu'à ses pensées, even in his or her thoughts. C'est lui qui décide du sens de sa condition. He or she nevertheless decides about or on the meaning of that condition, as Schmidt would say, to decide on the exception. And a little later, selon qu'il se choisit, résigné ou révolutionnaire, depending on whether he or she chooses himself to be accepting, résigné, with resignation. No, resignation means something else in English. Passively accepting, I would say, things as they are, or being a revolutionary. Et c'est de ce choix qu'il est responsable, and it is this choice that represents his or her responsibility, non point libre de ne pas choisir, never free not to choose, and Bernard has commented on that. Il est engagé, il, so this is masculine, I have to admit, he's engagé. Il faut parier, il faut parier. You have to wager. Now, this is, of course, very striking because it is not, first of all, it is no longer only about the writer or the intellectual. It is about les hommes as presented here. Yes, of course, Julia, Banda, Nadia, I'll come to that in a minute. It is about the man or the human as proletarian or bourgeois. There are some Heideggerian undertones there, thrownness into the situation, meaning the world, the temporality, the historicity. But above all, of course, it is a quasi and an absolutely intentional quotation, direct quotation of Pascal's famous development on the, Blaise Pascal's famous development on the wigger, which I quote and not translate. Oui, il faut parier, cela n'est pas volontaire, vous êtes embarqué. You are on board, you are dans le coup. Now, to cut short, this, I hope I'm not bothering you. The real effective choice is, in fact, the extreme or radical choice between endorsing the situation or rejecting the situation and the power relations it involves, or rejecting it completely and draw the consequences from there. And as a consequence, of course, some typical antinomic consequences follow, which I want to insist on. First, to choose means, is it okay? Are you following me? Yes. Okay. To choose means to be involved. That means you're no longer a spectator, however enthusiastic the spectator. Interesting bifurcation possible here, because as we know, Kant in the famous text on the Aufklärung was an enthusiastic spectator, and Foucault, in a sense, followed on that. Means to be involved in the first person. It means to commit oneself without reservation, without remainder, at the risk of certain sacrifices, including the sacrifice of the intelligence, or something we could call the intellectual distance. No distance. And of course, that opens wide the question whether there is something like an inevitable remainder, or a form of permanent regret, I would say, which is what again Bernard Harcourt beautifully suggests when he points at the paradox of Sartre's fascination with Flaubert, which I am tempted to translate in the form: Flaubert is, for Sartre, is himself as another. But also it has to do with the question that continuously fascinated Sartre, and it's a very important question: what is a bourgeois, whether an artist or not? So probably there are different modalities, and here it would be to deal with that question. And it would be interesting if we had time, but that could come in the discussion, to evoke, of course, other figures. The one who comes to my mind, because I admire her enormously, and she's exactly the same generation as Sartre and dealt with the same problems in a sense, but very differently in 20th century France, is Simone Weil. She does what Sartre did not do. She goes to the factory, and others did that after. That's a form of consequence. Did it include the sacrifice of the intelligence? To some extent, for some time, but it returned with a revenge. Now, second antinomy: to choose means to choose all the consequences, which are, and of course, these consequences are essentially incalculable, which I use in a somewhat Derridian manner, meaning they are unpredictable, they are ungovernable, and of course they are illimited. I mean, they have no end. They keep running, and so that involves, I believe, the idea of a certain perilous obstinacy. I think of a beautiful book by Oskar Nicht and Alexander Kluge, which has this title, Obstinacy and History. Not only, therefore, considering or envisaging the and running the experience of error, but the experience of enforcing the error. It came to my mind the silly idea that a good equivalent for engagement in that sense would be the river of no return. Remember that beautiful movie. Now, a second discussion, very as quickly as I can. Gramsci. Gramsci's organic intellectual, and here I want to look at it not only as theorized, as Gramsci could theorize, I mean, in the form of fragments, as we know, but some of them are extremely coherent and systematic, but as practiced or enacted by Antonio Gramsci himself. And of course, here, the circumstances are absolutely crucial. It's difficult to reduce Gramsci to, as an intellectual, to a quick definition, but you nevertheless must remember that this is a party leader. It's more than a party leader, it's the founding figure for the Italian Communist Party, emerging from revolutionary circumstances, events, and experiences, which you can put under the amazing name Revolution Against Capital. This is the one that he used for the Russian Revolution, but it's applicable to the Council Revolution in Italy, in Torino as well. Hope Nadia agrees with that. And it includes the remarkable pun, revolution against capital means we attack capitalism, but we do it against the something that had been a lesson that had been taught on the basis of Marx's great book. And then after that, I know that I simplify enormously, this party leader is co-opted in the direction of the Communist International. But first of all, he's called to Moscow and he receives a Bolshevik education. I'm tempted to say a re-education at the party school in Moscow. On the other hand, this is a philosopher, this is a historian, this is a philologist, this is a journalist who, I insist on that, he's for me the absolute example of that, never sacrifices in intelligence, which in particular means that he never gave up working with concepts and elaborating the concepts he thought were needed by the situation. This is true before the prison, and if we had time, we could say something about that, the Southern question, which after all, whose main legacy is our common universal use of the category of subaltern in today's critical theory, but above all, of course, during the prison years. And during the prison years, Gramsci is caught. This is something really terrible. When I progressively discovered that, I have to say that I was profoundly shocked. He's caught in a double bind, and in some sense, he's in a double prison. He's caught in Mussolini's jail, but within Mussolini's jail, he's isolated from the other prisoners by his own party comrades, because he's no longer politically reliable and perhaps even considered a dangerous mind. Of course, fortunately, there are some messengers who make it possible for him to communicate with the outside, that is Piero Sraffa and his sister-in-law, Tanya. And in that situation, I speak of a double bind because he's working, I'm very quick, but he's working against Stalinism and increasingly so, but from within, or siding, I would say, with the organization, with the Stalinist organization, that is at the same time in a life or death confrontation with fascism. There are other cases that we could, with which we could find analogies. Now, if we come to the concept, I, despite, or because Bernard has already said a lot about that, I'm extremely quick on the question of hegemony, historic bloc, etc., except to say, and perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion, that I disagree, at least with the letter of Bernard's endorsement of the Leninist idea that strategically cultural revolution must and can only come after or second to the political revolution, that is, to the moment of seizing power on behalf of the dominated class. I believe that this is wrong, but I also suspect that there is here, we face here the consequences of the terrible ambiguity of the word culture. Whose meaning seems to be oscillating from precisely literature or popular culture on one side to theory and intellectual activity on the other side. So, at the very least, I would say that from Gramsci's point of view, that appears here to be something like a Leninist against Lenin himself, or against something of Lenin, this idea that there should be a priority on one side or the other side is meaningless. And it is closely related to something that in the history of the labor movement and others, we know as the two-step strategy, which is common to the reformists and the Bolsheviks. First, seize power. Second, change the culture and the ideas of people. I believe that for Gramsci, there can be no priority or ordering between political and theoretical class struggles. Here, of course, on purpose, I use Althusser's terminology, which perhaps can be disputed and was his reaction to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. But of course, there can be no priority, but as a consequence, there is something like an aporia or a strategic difficulty of articulating politics and theory, which is not only conceptual, but is also, of course, in most cases, existential and personal, because, of course, you can't do everything at the same time. So you face choices, sometimes resolved in what I'm tempted to call ironically favorable circumstances, but the most favorable circumstances to resolve this kind of dilemma, that is to do both things at the same time, are tragic circumstances or catastrophic circumstances. Think of Marx in 1851 or precisely Gramsci in the 30s. Now this takes us to the key formula: pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. As you probably know, there are no more than 5 or 6 occurrences of this formula in Gramsci, but it is certainly central and very important. As well known, there are lots of extremely interesting commentaries on that in English and in Italian. In particular, this is not his own coinage, but I leave that aside. Now, the key passage, of course, that I thank you very much, profoundly, Bernard, for retrieving for me, because I didn't have it in English, is the one that you added to the list of readings, the passage in the notebook. You found it. I had it in Italian, but the notebook 1, paragraph 63, and we will leave, of course, a lot of that aside, the references to Croce, to Loria, to Grazia Dei, etc., and concentrate on 2 things, beginning with the end. Still, it's interesting that if you look at the content of the passage, it's about utopias of sexual revolution, which we might find a very interesting issue to combine with that. But if you begin at the end, the final sentence reads, it is necessary to create sober, patient people who do not despair in the face of the worst horrors and who do not become exuberant with every silliness. Pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. And from there, I suggest that you return to the sentences at the bottom of the first page and the top of the second, which rereading them, I found quite extraordinary, because it strikes as a subterranean current of popular romanticism created by the cult of science, by the religion of progress, and by the general optimism of the 19th century. In this regard, one must consider the validity of Marx's reaction. He poured cold water over the enthusiasm with his law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, etc., etc. These optimistic currents have hindered a more accurate analysis of Marxism, etc., etc. So this, of course, is I find very, very important. He poured cold water over the enthusiasm. And here, of course, lies the deep affinity with Max Weber's analysis of the twin vocations or barouches. Now, this cold water can be a rather sophisticated conceptual elaborations. And I tend to see many of Gramsci's most interesting contributions to the Marxist tradition or post-Marxist tradition as examples of cold water. Now, the most interesting of them for me is the concept of passive revolution, which, if you think about it, creates a profound disease among revolutionaries and especially among Marxists. Why? Because it makes it more difficult to build on the analogy between the bourgeois and the proletarian revolution. And above all, because it suggests something like a revolution without revolution, to quote Robespierre's formula that Zizek likes so much, namely a deep transformation of the society, but in the interest of the dominant class. And this is, of course, what Gramsci was trying to understand and to find in the example of Ford and Americanism and Fordism. You might want to add Roosevelt. So his concept of the war of position is linked to that. And of course, there is a consequence there, which is the idea that a revolution can take place in which the masses, the subalterns, the class, are passive. That is, of course, they are not hegemonic and not organized. But the worst of all, which you perceive in some corners of Gramsci's writing, is the question he's asking himself and asking his comrades. No wonder that they isolated him in the prison about Russia after the 1917 revolution or after the death of Lenin under Stalin, importing Taylorism, trying to Americanize in some sense the Russian revolution, and therefore perhaps that was the enigma, reversing the very meaning of that revolution. I'm afraid my 40 minutes are exhausted, aren't they?
Almost.
Okay.
Almost, yeah.
Okay. I exaggerate a little bit. Okay, not too much. Now, I think that a comparison with Fanon would be crucial here and would be particularly interesting, particularly around the issues, I would say, of what appears as Fanon's extremism. And I use the term in a positive sense, radicality, which is best expressed in passages, for example, in the conclusion of The Wretch of the Earth, where he describes the no return, the break without return with the European models of technology, development, and in fact, politics. The European game is finally over. We must look for something else. But then, of course, juxtaposed to that, you have what I dare to call Fanon's intellectualism, which makes, in particular, a permanent use of every tool that the philosophical, the psychiatric or medical, the anthropological thinking of Europe or a certain part of Europe has elaborated. And finally, these two aspects merge in something which for me is the most fascinating and is one of the most fascinating aspects of Fanon's activity and thinking, and also the most complex, that is his internationalism. His internationalism is a long, evolving history, which is entirely commended by the circumstances and the choices he made in these circumstances. Had Fanon not been sent as a French, quote unquote, brilliant, but black psychiatrist to the hospital of Blida in Algeria, you would never have had this revolutionary thinker and leader, in a sense, or at least intellectual leader, and the greatest of all them, of the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial Algerian struggle. So this is a little quick, but you can say that the anti-colonial or anti-imperialist struggle that Fanon, for a number of reasons, could not fight in the Caribbean, in the Martinique. He found the possibility against the French imperialism. He found the possibility to fight in Algeria. The enemy, in a sense, was still the same. The adversary, albeit perhaps not exactly, as the subsequent history has shown, with exactly the same determinations. And then from there, setting out to create a Pan-African revolutionary movement until this is the final touch before he dies of leukemia a few months after finishing The Wretch of the Earth. I'm not even sure he saw the book. His final interrogations, which resonate today as in a prophetic manner, about the possibilities that African national independences become cradles of corruption. So turn against their initial goals, with the help, of course, of the American interventions and all that, but also some internal factors. Now, perhaps we must read this with a new perspective, together with a new perspective on the question of violence as the necessary and even, in Sartre's description, redemptory revolutionary instrument. I have argued that in other places. It's a delicate matter, but I think that I don't say that Sartre is betraying Fanon, but he's he's mythologizing something of Fanon. So Fanon also is just as preoccupied as Gramsci, I think, by the inner complexity, the ambivalence of the opposition between activity or activism and passivity or subalternity, if you like, without which there is no revolutionary practice. And contrary to Lenin, or to something in Lenin, but that was prevalent, not contrary to Weber, he's deeply aware of the fact that violence as a political instrument does not leave the agents or the political collective subject unchanged, unaltered. The whole question is whether it changes them in the sense of redemption or it changes them in the sense of corruption. Now, finally, and I know that I'm really exaggerating, but I only need 2 minutes now. I would say a few words about my own ethical and political problem with engagement, which could be called, I'm tempted to choose here as an equivalent or a partial equivalent, ultra optimism of the will. So that precisely all the consequences are accepted in advance. From the point of view of the pessimism of intelligence, which could be understood as something like if our meaning or our understanding of intelligence is something like methodological pessimism. Now, in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, there is a wonderful description of the revolutionary intellectual. And of course, this is a self-description. I mean, it applies clearly to how they see themselves, which I believe resonates like an anticipated refutation. Thank you, Nadia, for remembering us of that title. An anticipated refutation of the idea of the trahison des clercs. Julien Benda, 1927, the treason of the, what do you say, the clerks? Can you say that? I'm not sure. Why are they traitors from Benda's point of view? Because they abandon their universalistic point of view for the sake of rallying an ideology, or if you prefer, a party or a cause, which is now I say that Marx and Engels provide an anticipatory or a refutation because they explain that when the final crisis of capitalism is approaching, which at the time they believed was the case, they didn't believed it for long, but at the time, bourgeois ideologues or intellectuals, and these can be academics, writers, and so on, change side. That is, they betray their camp, they betray their class, they become traitors. And I'm completely I completely accept the idea that an engaged intellectual in our society is a traitor. He's a traitor to his or her own training, class, environment, and so on. Now, of course, this is not just from Marx and Engels' point of view to follow the side which seems to be on the rise. But it is to intellectually work within that party and take the corresponding risks. Therefore, they become engaged. Now, there are two aspects in this idea, and I'm done. The idea of the final crisis, the imminent revolution, which has equivalence. Many of us, when we engage in a cause or in a party, this is because we believe that the change is imminent or the end is in sight. So this is eschatological and this is deterministic. And of course, it's completely incompatible with the Pascalian idea of the wager, which I introduced as a hermeneutic tool to interpret Sartre. But the idea of treason I find illuminating because in a different conjuncture, it also raises the question which I must say haunts me, and I'm sure it haunts many of us, as an intellectual moving from being organic to the dominant class, to trying to become organic as much as possible to the dominated or rebellious, revolting groups in the society, how not to betray at some point our own treason or ever become something a renegade. And of course, the renegades are become heroes for the dominant power structures and the academia and so on. And the 20th century is full of that. I mean, and it produces remarkable results because some of the most intelligent intellectuals in the 20th century, especially in America, not only Daniel Bell, etc., are all ex-communist, ex-Trotskyist, and so on. Who is the author of the managerial state? This is the most, Burnham. Burnham is one of the most interesting of. Now, I think this is all the more difficult because, as I said in the beginning, the party which you rally or which you join, whether organized or not, does not stay in the same place or referring or pursuing, I would say, the same cause when the conjuncture changes. The name can be there still, but the substance is very different. Now, my motto precisely for that reason would be never sacrifice the intelligence provided it is pessimistic, as a reverse side of the optimism of the will itself, which means perform the task of criticizing the dominant ideology, for sure, but also of criticizing or being critical to your own side. Now, Althusser had taken somewhere, or claimed that he had taken somewhere from Machiavelli the formula, critical theorist is one who's a political critical theorist, is one who is shooting against his or her own army. In Foucauldian and Edward Said's terms, it could be also something like speak truth not only to power, but to the counter-power itself. Why? Because there is no revolutionary or emancipatory movement that does not deviate from its goals. The risk, of course, is, and I am done, is that the critique is worse than the deviation. And that happens very often, or it's just another deviation, not better. And the risk is also that the intellectual recreates the very complacent figure of the critical mind, who from above or from outside surveys, monitors, evaluates the movement, what the activists are doing, etc. So how to avoid that? A partial Gramscian answer would be nobody is an intellectual by status. This risk is particularly linked to the fact that explicitly or implicitly you proclaim something like, I am an intellectual. I am an intellectual, I am a member of that group by status or because I've studied a lot. Even nobody is an intellectual by status, even less, of course, a critical intellectual. And here, of course, we're remembered of Gramsci's enigmatic motto, everybody is an intellectual or can be one. Another more fundamental answer, quasi-Sartrean or post-Sartrean, would be internal criticism is not delinking. I'm not sure if you can say engagé in English, or if you can say dégagé, disengaging oneself from your engagement. On the contrary, engagement remains the absolute condition. So internal critique is not what allows you to suspend your engagement. It's what makes it irreversible, protecting as much as possible against betraying your own treason in the historical sense. And of course, you see that at the end, I reach a circle, a kind of finitude or contingency. And I can't help. I'm aware of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Étienne. Thank you so much. So I have so many thoughts, and we have so many extraordinary folks in the seminar who I'm going to ask Fonda to please turn on the videos. Biodun Jeyifo is here, and Stoller, Bachir, Diagne, Bruce Robbins, Camille Ropsis, Carmen, Dege, Gossett, Daniel White, Federico Testa, John Rackman, Madeline Dobby, Nadia. Urbinati had to go teach. Neni, Panourgia, Penelope Deutscher, Stuart Elden, Mamadou Diallo, Robert Harvey, Alyssa Battistoni, Adi Ophir, Alice Atty, so many others. So we're going to have such a great, and we've got approximately, less than an hour. So what I want to do is give a few thoughts, invite people to come in, and we also have some great questions that have come in already. Rafi Resnick asks, should speaking the truth to the counterpower be done with the same passion and rigor and amount of energy as speaking truth to power? It's a fascinating question. And Robert Harvey's also got a great question about the difference between la cause du peuple versus
Hi, Robert.
le
Thanks
cri
for
du peuple.
coming.
And Robert's going to be on in a second.
So glad that you're here.
As soon as everyone
all the
turns
others
on
as
their
well, of course.
videos, everybody. So turn on your videos. But very quickly, as we wait for everyone to come in, I did want to. So your talk and this question of treason and this question of giving meaning to one's acts, of course, with Sartre, it just made me think throughout the talk, right? Through Les Mains Sales, right? His play Les Mains Sales, which is all about a party moving in a way, about someone, Hugo, the protagonist, who originally goes in to actually assassinate Oderer, who was the leftist party leader, but then eventually changes minds, but eventually wish it does because Oderer, he believes Oderer is having an affair with his spouse, and there's this final moment in that play, you'll remember, where he's released from prison. He'd been captured. He gets released from prison, and he has to, in some sense, give meaning to his act, give meaning to the act of having killed the party leader in that context. And he does by committing suicide at the end. He opens the door and he says, he kind of like,
not what I am advocating.
No. I understand. But what he was trying to do in that context was give meaning to his acts. And you were talking about the fact that for Sartre, right, a piece of the choice of being in dans le coup, that what is giving the ability to give meaning to your own acts. And of course, I think that's what Les Mains Sales is all about. And of course, that was what Sartre in many ways was all about. He specifically spoke about the way in which one can give meaning to one's own acts. But I wonder if, and maybe it's too much to generalize, but I wonder if that helps situate the difference between Sartre as engaged philosopher, Gramsci as revolutionary philosopher. This idea of the being able to give meaning to acts and to one's own acts has a certain self-referentiality to it, right? That means that one is still, one is removed in a way, because with that power and maybe that hubris, though, comes the ability to kind of define oneself, define one's situation, right? And so it's difficult to generalize, but it might be one dimension along which one could differentiate what I would call a revolutionary worldly philosopher like Gramsci and the engaged philosopher, particularly for Sartre. Now, and this brings back also the question you had mentioned at the beginning. You had spoken about the personal dimension of these issues and of these questions, and that brings me back, of course, to Sartre's personal engagement and to the difference between that personal engagement and the referentiality on the one hand, and the political that I still hear somehow in a different tone, with a different texture in someone like, for instance, C.L.R. James, who I had used as a segue from our last seminar, where he writes about his book, right? Where he writes about his book, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, where he writes, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, this was a personal response to extreme situations. I am doing a political response to extreme political situation. And I don't know if there is something about the potential difference between the worldly and the and the engaged philosopher. But let's do this. Let me invite others to jump in because this is going to be such a rich discussion. Can everyone turn on their videos? Are you able to do that? Are we having a problem with that right now? No. Okay. Hi, Stuart. How are you doing? Hi, Robert. Jay, wonderful to see you. Carmen, Ellis, and it's wonderful. Everybody is here. So I know, Anne, you wanted to jump in. Maybe you can kick us off with a comment if you'd like to. I see Sarah has her hand up. Of course, we heard from Robert already a question about la cause du peuple versus le cri du peuple. Étienne, you're going to have to. I think maybe we should give voice to other reactions first, and then give you a chance to come back in. How about that? Would that be good? Okay. Anne, do you want to jump in first?
Sure, I would love to. I thought this was just brilliant from two of my most favorite brilliant friends. I can't stay for the whole thing because I'm doing a global webinar exactly on this issue for Niger at 3 o'clock. But I did want to say something about the cultural, the aesthetic, and the political. And I think it's really important, and I think it's something that comes up a lot in, quote, the West, is not the appreciation that the forms that various kinds of counter take, as Bernard writes about so beautifully, the counter, are in the same terms. That what is happening with the cultural is that the political is being redefined. That the political is not a steady state, that the aesthetic, as we see in Palestine right now, in so many places in Africa, is being called upon as political, as strongly political, and has been for a really long time. So for me, I've been doing work on what I call the Anti-Colonial Avant-Garde, that there is no avant-garde that is not already anti-colonial. And the title I give to that is Poetic Rage, that there is no poetic and rage that are a part in this kind of other kind that makes us, puts the demand on us to not let the political stay stale and mute, but something that itself is being transformed in the process. So thank you both. So wonderful to have this occasion and so many other things to say, but I know others want to as well. I guess there's one other thing that I really did want to say, and it's something about the ways in which we account for ourselves, as Judith says, as Judith Butler says, because there's in anthropology, sometimes it becomes navel gazing, in which you become the anthropologic subject because that's the only way you can do it, supposedly. But there is a way in philosophy, and maybe this is just my prejudice, and why I'm so attracted to the notion of field work in philosophy, as Étienne knows very well, is that the person, the body, is put aside. Maybe the intellect, the personal intellect is not, but the body, the embodiment and the flesh is put aside. And we can see right now so much in Black studies, but way before that, that is a really critical part of what's going on, that somehow always is sort of à part, right? Particularly from men, particularly from men. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. So I see so many of you, BJ's with us, and we started this conversation on worldly philosophers with BJ. Biodun, Jeyifo, do you want to jump in? Sorry to.
Well, just quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
You say, Étienne, this is incredible. This has been like extraordinarily rich presentation, and perhaps I'll make a commentary later on. I don't know, but right now I just want to thank you. And just to make a very quick comment, this is a side comment, but this is only.
Excuse me. Oh yes, now I see you. No,
Okay.
because at some point You were below the level
Oh, yeah,
of
yeah.
not the sea, but the cameras.
I'm still
Forgive me
swinging
for
from
that.
I'm still swinging from the from your presentation. You know. So the quick comment I want to make is just a general reflection. Fanon, the point about Fanon having had to go to Algeria, to North Africa, to make the revolution. Actually, this is a very important point because this was also true of Sailor James. This was true of George Padmore. There's a whole range, men and women, who went so. And I think that without making it into a kind of mystique, I think what it points to is how Fanon becomes very typical of something which was very Caribbean, but actually it was also very worldly, which is that he came from a class which was in the Caribbean, could not make a revolution. The historical, economic, geopolitical, factors made them incapable of making a revolution. But however, because class, we have to understand in internationalist terms, they were part of a class, formed across, nations and the, different geopolitical, context of global capitalism, found themselves in other places, other sites of global capitalist and imperialist, struggles as revolutionary in a way in which they could not have been in the Caribbean. It's not as if there was a complete, absence of revolution, since one of the first great modern revolutions, the Asian Revolution, took place in the Caribbean, but that was the very early, phase of capitalism. And so at a later stage, Fanon found himself in this context. So I'm introducing this as a kind of complication of the term worldly. The Caribbean revolutionaries were worldly in a very special sense, in which Fanon is perhaps the best example we have, but which does not only. So while we respect the singularity, and I like that term immensely that you've introduced into the discussion, while we do recognize Fanon's singularity, we should see how the term worldly, which is so crucial to this series, defines Fanon in a way that links him with C.L.R. James and the others. That the revolution they could not make in the Caribbean, they helped to make in other parts of the world, especially in Africa. I mean, Caribbean revolutionaries are so central to revolution in what is now called the Black World, the Black Atlantic, in Africa itself. And that was, part of this worldliness, this internationalism. I just wanted to add that thought. But thank you so much, Étienne, for your incredibly rich, reflections.
PJ, thank you, PJ, and thanks for being with us. And let's do this. I know, Robert, you had the comment about la cause du peuple versus le cri du peuple. Why don't you say just something quickly about that, and then Sarah, you've got your hand up, and then maybe we can go back to Étienne, and then we'll come back to, and then Carmen, you just put your hand up. Okay, so Robert, do you want to just say a word about that distinction as you see it?
Sure. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I have a distinction here or not. But as Étienne was giving voice to his relative discomfort, I believe that I was hearing him speak about the discomfort that he felt with the expression La Cause du Peuple, which was the name of the Maoist newspaper, which then Sartre went on to defend himself later on. I wondered if the engaged intellectual in Étienne's mind is able to position herself in a slightly different way and perhaps a little bit more acceptable a way if she says, or if she uses the expression le cri du peuple, which of course is a reference to the newspaper that was founded by Jules Vallès 150 years ago during the Paris Commune. Isn't that? I hear in the difference between these two expressions a different positioning of the intellectual. When I speak of la cause du peuple, I'm speaking of a cause that I am espousing, but I'm espousing that cause from the outside. Whereas when I announce with the title of my newspaper, the cry or the shout of the people, the yell of the people, it seems to me that maybe I'm speaking from inside that class of which I'm speaking. So that's all.
Great. Yeah, no, I mean, and that is a theme that runs through our conversation, which is speaking of versus speaking or it's a little bit the difference between it is the difference in a way between Fanon writing in The Wretched of the Earth and Sartre writing about the wretched of the earth in a way, right? Sarah, do you want to jump in, and then we'll give Étienne, or maybe we'll get in Carmen as well. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that great talk and for that great conversation, and thank you for having the chance to be part of this. And my question is a bit a continuation of the discussion we just had, and I would like, well, during the talk, I thought through the place of the engaged intellectual. And in the blog post that Bernard posted, there was Sartre's famous understanding of being the intellectuel engagé, who takes side for or against. And in the beginning, Monsieur Balibar retook to some extent this formulation and asked to what extent the engaged intellectual is on every side. And from a Foucauldian point of view, I was wondering whether rather...
Excuse me, to what extent the engaged intellectual is what?
On every side, I understood you.
Oh, on every side, yes.
And my point of view was, from a Foucauldian perspective, whether it would be important to ask of the conditions that lay beyond that process of taking sides, because the problem of taking sides seems to be that there would be a voluntaristic individual that can choose what one can do or what can one not to do, but then one falls back to that ideological problem that one is always bound to the conditions one lives and thinks and through the context.
Thanks, Sarah. Maybe we can get in one more. I know this is a lot, Étienne, but then we can do another round. But Carmen, do you want to jump in or?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Yeah.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah,
I'm really glad. It's because of the time. Usually you're meeting in the middle of my night. So
right.
we should meet with you, Professor Balibar, more often. Do it like earlier. I have a question that is also addressing this kind of paradox that's already implicit in the term engaged philosopher, right? Because you need to deal with the question of intellect. How much do you kind of sacrifice the intellect, and what does that do for you, like from the very beginning? And I think they all struggle with that, right? We have like the term, like the two ethics in Weber. We have in Gramsci like a very strong use of mythology, and in Sartre, and that's what I'd like to kind of emphasize here, or kind of focus on right now. We have the problem of bad faith and ignorance, right? So, and I'm really struck by not only his preface to Wretched of the Earth, but also Black Orpheus, and how Fanon is actually criticizing Black Orpheus in Black Skin, White Masks, precisely for intellectualizing the Black position, right? And kind of overly emphasizing consciousness, and that the Black race has to become conscious of itself and fight against, in a Hegelian manner, racism in order to kind of end up in a raceless society, right? And Fanon is like, listen, this is you're intellectualizing Black existence, and I do need ignorance in order to have the motivation to act, right? So, and interestingly, Sartre himself, in What is Literature, says that, quote, it is in love, in hate, in anger, in fear, in joy and indignation, and admiration, and hope and despair that man and the world reveal themselves in their truth. So there he is stressing this kind of being in the situation, right? And yet then in Anti-Semite and Jew, he's elaborating the problems of passion, right? So I'd really love to know more about like ignorance and what kind of role does ignorance play for the engaged philosopher, because sometimes he or she is using it, and sometimes he or she is exactly trying to go against it because ignorance is what produces and creates domination.
Thank you, Carmen, and thanks for that. That was brilliant. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Étienne. Although I'm trying to also follow the chat, and Bachir Diagne says hi, and he can't turn his camera on because he doesn't have a camera on his device. But he did want to thank you, Étienne. He did want to thank you, Étienne, for bringing in Simone Weil, and he writes, she discovers colonialism in 1931 and expresses shame and ethical revolt as reason for engagement, at a time when the Party of the Workers ignored workers in the colonies and the left celebrated the exposition coloniale, except the surrealists. This is different from the situation of engagement as the ideal situation of making a choice. So special call out here for Simone Weil in this particular conversation. Go ahead, Étienne. I know there's a lot, but maybe you don't have to respond to individuals, but maybe just,
I can't. With the best possible intentions, I could not. But first of all, I took good notes. Excuse me. I still have the tail of a kind of cold which makes me cough. Okay. Allow me to say something quickly, if I can, but about Sartre putting together some of the questions, particularly from Carmen and from Sarah, but also perhaps Bernard himself. I hope I'm not misunderstood. Perhaps I'm wrong, of course, but I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not trying to propose something like an ideal, beautiful picture of Sartre as the model of the intellectual engagé. I'm in a sense, I admit all the weaknesses and the shortcomings and the errors and the failures, etc., of Sartre, which nevertheless have a certain grandeur, I would say greatness, because Sartre was never a man of, as we say in French, demi-mesure. He didn't choose the middle. He never chose the simple, as so many of us do, me particularly, and the cautious attitude. Oh, there is some truth on that side, and clearly there is also some truth on that. So that creates a problem. That will lead us to the question of ignorance, and therefore better stay on the side. That I know he almost always did exactly the opposite. And that's why he was so easily and virulently criticized by so many. But this being said about Sartre's greatness, what I was trying to do, and not only with Sartre, of course, because Engagement was only the first, my first reference, and then I came to Gramsci, was picking up the category, of course, relying on his own formulations, which rereading them, I find quite remarkable. There's a kind of course, there is a philosophical culture behind that. And trying to explain that that the category can be used and perhaps expanded and transformed beyond Sartre's own case and the way. I'm not saying he's not an intellectual engagé, of course he is. But what I'm trying to reflect upon is the combination of the articulation of intellectuality and engagement in a manner that is at the same time as radical as possible and as universal as possible. And from that point of view, and that will take me back also to Beji's question and so on, and the comparison with Fanon. Bernard argues in a sense, and he's repeated that in his first intervention, there's something in Fanon that you don't find in Sartre. Perhaps there's something in Sartre that you don't find in Fanon, but that's not our problem. And I would not disagree with that. But that thing that you find in Fanon, and that is not just the fact that he's on the front, that he's fighting. It's the fact that his intelligence is entirely committed to the cause of the revolution. And I tried very quickly to suggest that that was not uncritical. That was so. I don't see Fanon as a counterexample to a possible, I would say, definition of engagement intellectuel. It's not, on the contrary. I would be almost tempted to say, okay, Sartre is a good example, but Fanon is an even better example, provided we understand this notion of engagement in a certain manner. Now, of course, this almost immediately leads to the the two questions raised by Sarah and Carmen, which I take very seriously. Sarah, he says to me, you said that intellectual engagés are on all sides. And I quoted Zizek and so on. And I maintain that. But she seems to argue, correct me if I'm wrong, from a pure Sartrean point of view, and that's of course Sartre's philosophy, because the choice in a situation that you had not chosen, and with a social background which you also have not chosen, is a pure act of freedom or liberty. Are you suggesting that the examples that we could take would lead to such conclusions as Fanon or Gramsci could have become fascists, just chosen? And of course, I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing that. I completely agree that they're pushed in a certain direction by personal experiences, which are also, of course, collective and have a social meaning. But there's no determinism there. There's no determinism there. So that first, the distinction between, with due respect paid to C.L.R. James, and God knows how much more he understands of that than what I personally do, I find the rhetorical opposition between the personal response and the political response very mechanistic and unsatisfactory. I don't even believe that this is true for him. And perhaps here I can also take something from Anne's intervention. If you include the cultural in the political, and if you see the personal from the point of view not only of the intellect but also of the body, in the sense in which she said, then the two things will intersect at some point, and therefore there's no determinism. But the answer is not that you decide yourself either for political reasons or for personal reasons. As soon as you say that, the whole question that we are trying to discuss is eliminated. Now, so to put it more simply, I completely agree that there are objective reasons playing a decisive role, but we perfectly know that people with coming from the working classes or racialized people, black people, or women, do not automatically become actors and activists for their own cause. So in the end, perhaps this sounds a little mystical, but here I'm tempted to quote Derrida, I mean, who says, and he must remember Sartre, the decision is always the decision of the other. You might translate that, if you don't like this terminology, or it's you're not deciding only for yourself, and some of the deepest reasons why you decide and commit yourself and enter the river of no return that I was describing must remain unknown to yourself. That's what you're coping with, including your passion, including your rage, what you call the rage. Why are you enraged? You never know that. You may have some very good reasons, but perhaps I'm wrong. And then that leads to the question of ignorance, of course, because yes, I mean, perhaps this is cheap psychology, but I completely agree that with all I said about being critical of your own camp, speaking truth to the counter power, etc., you can't do. You may believe that the unity of opposites is the inevitable and essential perspective, but you can't at the same time organize the demonstration and ask yourself, is that the good strategy? Am I not on the wrong side? So it's not a mere question of suspending your judgment. It's a question of accepting the ignorance, without which there is no action. Oh, Neni, hi. And so, okay, I'm too long, and perhaps my case becomes very very bad. So quickly to Robert, I'm not. Thank you for bringing in Valès, and above all, thank you, and I think we all agree on that, for suggesting that the essential question, or one of the basic question, is who speaks for whom. Who speaks for whom, and who speaks to whom. which is also what Bernard has put rightly in the center of his comments. Whom does Sartre speak to? Whom does Fanon speak to? Again, on this matter, and especially looking at Fanon, I'm not. I don't believe there is a. This is a question. I don't believe it's a dichotomy. In a sense, I'm ready to accept, and that's his limitation precisely, and that's a contingency. Because he's a French agrégé de philosophie and a writer in Paris, although taking risks, but not so many risks, because as soon as he was famous, as you know, de Gaulle famously said at the time, we cannot arrest Sartre because you do not put Voltaire in a jail, and that would be, etc. So he was protected in a sense by his status, reputation. But leave that. I would admit that Sartre speaks to the Europeans and to the whites, to the French, and forces them. There's something very strong and violent there to listen to something that they do not want by any means to hear. And that's extremely relevant today. This is more than ever the case with the situation of state or institutional racism that we have in France today and other causes. As for the question whether Fanon speaks only to, say, his own camp, no, I don't believe so. Otherwise, of course, The Wretch of the Earth is published by Maspero in Paris because this is where it can be after that brought back to Africa, etc. Not to the partisan troops, but to the world and to the world. But I believe that Fanon never ceased to speak to a French audience, not in the sense that he wanted to conciliate, to not please, of course, but to bring them to his cause. He didn't care, I believe, very much about that. He thought that the forces he had to rely on were not in France. Perhaps he was, but his writing, speaks to the French. His writing is an extraordinary, efficient, philosophical, literary style. So, like it or not, he speaks to the French, and therefore it's not the French and the others, a dichotomy. And he speaks to us today. If he didn't speak to the French in 1961, he would not speak to the international critical to the post-colonial audience today. There's a medium here. Which is not which is the language, which is the language. And now, of course, I'm not against the so Cri du Peuple is absolutely agree with that, is excellent, but I'm not against Cause du Peuple. I mean, the question is what do certain words mean in certain places at a certain moment? And the word peuple, the name peuple, is an especially, I'd say, volatile category, which doesn't. And finally, if you allow me, I turn back to BJ. I mean, for the good, I hope I didn't forget something, but I mentioned Anne's because I want to. BJ, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
I am. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much. I'm not going to, but. What came to my mind while listening to you was the implicit play on words, which perhaps doesn't work exactly in the same manner in English and in French, on world and worldly.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you were explaining that to be a worldly philosopher means to a theorist and means to include. I hate the word global, not a global perspective, but a perspective of the world. So we might be tempted to say something like a cosmopolitical perspective, which is also a problematic name.
No, actually, no, not quite. Well,
not quite.
Not quite, because I was using worldly among many other dimensions. I wasn't giving a single unitary conception. No, not at all.
I understand.
So,
but
in fact, if I'm to just 1 minute, 30 seconds, I was actually introducing it in the way of complicating the notion of self and other.
Yes, I
because
understand.
There's an otherness of Caribbean revolutionaries in Africa, in Europe. I
completely understand.
So that's, I was just offering one other dimension. Yeah.
Would you agree, would you go as far as saying something like a revolution, which is not just bourgeois, which is a revolution of the wretched, I mean the wretched of the earth, and there are many cases, etc. Needs not only to be internationalist, intellectually speaking, but it needs strangers. It needs strangers. So of course, as soon as you put it like that, it becomes perilous, because of course you'll provide counter examples, and you'll have to defend yourself against the idea that what you are suggesting is that the revolutionary spirit is imported from outside. Something like Fanon came from the Caribbean and he imported the revolutionary spirit into the Algerian War of Liberation, which clearly is not true. But he certainly imported into the Algerian War of Liberation something with which this war proved at the same time, which at the same time proved to be necessary internally and not only towards the outside, and which created a great unease. Because this revolution is muddy in many senses. You know, it's a conversation that sometimes we're tempted to have, and it's a dangerous way of going into the imaginary. But suppose Fanon did not die of leukemia in 1961. What would he do after 62? So probably, of course, because that was his main goal, become even more active and probably decisive in the attempt at developing the Pan-African revolutionary forces. But so Lumumba was killed, etc., etc. So you may easily imagine that Fanon would not have lived very long, because he would have been killed himself, either by the French or American special forces, as others, or hijacked and tortured and killed like Ben Barka, and so on. Or, this is the most embarrassing supposition, eliminated from the inside. Because the Algerian Revolution did not, of course, take the perfect road.
Yes.
So the stranger is needed, but the stranger is not the people.
And the stranger can always also find a home in other places in the world.
Yes.
And
yes,
everyone
but that's.
Who sets out to make a revolution?
That's perhaps another
strangeness.
Yes.
Even in their own homelands.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Good.
Okay, Bernard.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to make. I see we've got maybe two final thoughts.
Okay.
And then
thoughts, and I listen. I'll just listen.
Or Federico, three final thoughts. One. I've got one too. So maybe four final thoughts, and then maybe you can close us out. I realize we're we're going to go a little bit French seminar style, so we'll just go a little bit over. But I was thinking as I was listening, I mean, there was a point at which you said something like, well, Gramsci surely was an engaged philosopher, and I think there's no doubt of that. But the question becomes, if there are these distinctions, was he also, in addition, of course, a worldly philosopher, if we can maintain that concept?
Yes,
and it becomes a question of Venn diagram in a way, right?
I struggle against your dichotomy.
Yes, no, but the point I'm trying to make is maybe it's not a dichotomy, maybe it's a Venn diagram. Maybe it's a Venn diagram in which the notion of the revolutionary philosopher fits within the notion of the engaged philosopher. And I don't want to be engaging in, a nosological exercise here of just kind of categorizing, but I mean, it becomes important because of the questions that we're asking in the seminar, which is, if it is a Venn diagram like that, in which, one could think of certainly engaged, but then in a way, in a smaller subset within the engaged, the more revolutionary or worldly philosophers that we're trying to think about also, the question becomes, what are the different theoretical insights or praxis insights or that emerge from these different spaces in a way? I mean, that's ultimately the interesting question here. It's not really just to categorize or, it's not just an abstract exercise in locating, but it's actually to whether once we've done that and identified a core of some kind, whether is a different interaction with theory, or is it that theory plays a different role, or it pushes in certain ways in terms of the relationship between theory and praxis. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. That's not just, of course, I'm not suggesting anyone saying this, but it's not just an abstract exercise in placing people on, some spectrum or three-dimensional space or something. It's really to once we get at some of these potential differences, to see how theory and praxis plays out in particular ways. So, and then the only other thing I would say very quickly is, there is of course ideological drift, a term that Balkan used in a legal context, but this idea, I mean, Gramsci is of course very important now to the new right. I try to emphasize that a lot because it's really as if there's an appropriation, right? And that goes very much to your point of the possibilities of movement from one side to the other, but there is an appropriation that takes place. And so, there is this claim on the new right that they are the Gramscians of the right, using methods that were developed, et cetera.
Yes,
it's pretty simplistic, whatever. But
no.
But,
I know
but,
that.
But
I know that. It started in 68. It started in 68 with the French, what's his name? The guy of New Europe, etc.
Guillaume Fay?
No. More intelligent guy and more dangerous guy. The guy who created the journal.
Yes. It'll come to me in a minute.
It's de Benoit,
okay.
I think. It was also posted.
Who's that?
De Benoit. Alain
de Benoit. Alain de Benoit, exactly.
Right.
Alain de Benoit.
Right.
Alain de Benoit is the great.
Right.
And he's the most interesting because he does know Gramsci in a relatively yes, I would say in a deep manner. Whereas the appropriation that you describe, it seems to me, is very often based on an extremely simplistic Gramsci. And sorry to attack you on this again, but this is the Gramsci that seems to reverse Leninism in a mechanistic manner. Lenin, as you described. Believe me, I find what Lenin was trying to do in 23 with the question of cooperation and all that, something not only interesting, important, but crucial for the future of the revolution, which failed, blah, blah. It's just before the nap and so on. So I'm not criticizing Lenin's action. But the idea that what is revealed finally is that the cultural revolution, in the sense of a revolution in educational practices, can be developed only after the party and the organized proletarian forces have seized state power, the two-step strategy, blah, blah. And so what Anne said, we can no longer completely share, and I agree with her. This is what a certain easy or simple Gramscism reverses in a completely mechanistic manner. Instead of explaining that we first ought to seize the power, take the parliament, the police headquarters, etc. They explain we should first develop a cultural hegemony which rallies a bloc, etc. to us, so that at a certain point we only have to add a simple political kick, and the rotten fruit will fall into our hands. So that's a mechanistic reversal. It is so far from a real understanding of what Gramsci was doing, and particularly, I don't know who mentioned that. I think it was Anne. Again, his reflections on popular culture, that it's manipulation. So that's the Gramsci for the for not only for the
right. I wasn't attributing anything to Gramsci really. I was just going to Lenin to articulate that position. Actually, not attributing it to Gramsci. But
okay, sorry for
so you've got. Let's have the three quick interventions maybe, and then Étienne can say something final. Giacomo, Neni, and then Federico.
Hi, thanks.
Giacomo, where's Giacomo Bianchino?
How you doing? Thanks for the presentation. It's fantastic. I just wanted to say on one point that you made, and it's connected to what you were just talking about then, Bernard, in relation to the problem of the constitutive differences between forms of engagement, right? Is there a difference between engaging oneself to the right or to the left? And is there a political difference in that? And is there an aesthetic difference? And I wanted to suggest that there is, at least in the way that I understand engagement, and my particular focus is on the engaged intellectuals and literary writers of the 1920s and 1930s. On the one hand, those intellectuals who engage themselves to the right maintain the possibility of, because on the right, the figure of the independent intellectual and the independent mind still carries cultural currency and political currency. And the architects of the right of the 1920s in Italy and in Germany held out that Nietzschean concept of, being untimely, or, the individual mind and the critical mind, right? Because for them, at the end of the day, the problems that existed politically could still be resolved either personally or aesthetically. And the question of the political, therefore, had an ambiguity. So you could potentially switch allegiances and betray your betrayal, or be treasonous to your treason, while maintaining good conscience. Whereas on the left, the question of resolving the political antinomies is always going to have a political answer rather than an aesthetic answer. There's no aesthetic for the left. That's my contention anyway. And when it does become aesthetic, it ceases to be left. So in that sense, it presents the engaged left-wing intellectual with a real problem about being able to betray their betrayal, whether or not they can actually swap positions in good conscience, seeing as it's no longer their independent intelligence, which is the sort of the litmus test or the categorical test of whether something is incorrect or correct. So that'd be my only sort of intervention.
Great, thanks so much, Giacomo. Neni?
Thanks. Neni.
Yeah. Hi again. I am sick just like you are, different sickness, but so that's why I'm right here in front of the mirror. Sorry. So I know I'm conscious of time, so this will be really telegraphic. I want to go back to Sartre for a moment and think about the the engagement of the engaged intellectual. And I'm thinking, I think it is in what has been translated into English, I think, as anti-method or against method, where Sartre actually posits the fact that that intellectual engagement cannot be anything other than when the questioner, and the questioned are one. Right. So the question there becomes, what really for Sartre, taking, I think, off of Fanon, and here we can talk about it at maybe at another point, Étienne, Sartre here posits the question of both of the audience, readership, whom the philosopher addresses, but also the subject position of the philosopher herself, right? So the question that came, the discussion that came a little bit earlier between you and Dege about who is engaged in the revolution, I think that Sartre has already addressed it by saying that revolution cannot be a revolution unless the revolutionary, the revolted, and the question of the revolution are one, right? And which actually brings us, I think, back to the question of the audience of Fanon. And I think that I disagree with you, Étienne, here a little bit. I disagree with you. I think that Fanon clearly addressed the French when he is describing with Fanon, with immense detail, every single torture, every single torture that is being done on the Algerians. Fanon is not just addressing the Algerians; he's addressing the consciousness of the French. Okay. All right. So that's what I'm trying to think. I mean, as you know, I come from a generation and a political background where you could not be an intellectual unless you were in the left, unless you were engaged, unless you actually proposed political positions and political solutions to things that other people had perhaps been posited as purely aesthetic. So that I'm just wondering if perhaps we can just talk a little bit about this, or suspend it for a different moment.
Okay, thank you, Neni. Federico.
Okay, thanks. I'm aware of the time.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to be very brief and very selfish with my questions because they're related to things I've been thinking about, and I think Étienne touched upon it, and I want to ask that. So the first one is, if you think there's a history of what Foucault calls the revolutionary subjectivity, couldn't we say that the intellectual engagé is a case of a certain, let's say it's a case in that history, it's a figure of a history of the revolutionary subjectivity, of a mode of being a revolutionary subject? And if that's the case, aren't we talking about something that is fated to disappear or is in a process of disappearing? So that's my first question, briefly formulated. The second has to do with an issue of protagonism. It seems to me that a lot of what the intellectual engagé embodies in a figure like Sartre, for example, is, someone who speaks. So someone who formulates the truth of a certain struggle in the most universal terms as possible. Now, I ask myself if today the role of the intellectual is the same, if it's up to the intellectual to speak, or if there's a different set of practices that constitutes the activity of what would be an engaged intellectual today. So briefly, that's
great. Thank Federico.
Great.
And Stuart put in the chat box, but we're not going to have time to go over it entirely. But the great kind of hypothetical of the person of the engaged intellectual who writes under a pseudonym, right? And I love that idea, right? The pseudonym is being, in some sense, like, how does that make us think about kind of the publicity required of the engaged philosopher? Okay, Étienne, one final thought on your part, and sorry to go over our time.
These are absolutely marvelous questions. Federico, I would not say, perhaps I insisted on that, and the examples of Fanon that we took, Fanon and Sartre, pushed us in that direction, that the role of the function of the intellectual engagé is to speak the truth or speak. That's an important part, because politics is a public activity. And if we return to the question that, for example, Neni was raising, and I said that, in fact, we did not disagree. Of course, the pragmatic element is extremely important. Fanon's voice is being heard and helped by Sartre, Maspero, and all that by the French. What kind of effects does it produce? Does it paralyze the bad consciousness of the colonizer? Does it push more people to join the anti-colonial struggle? Does it, at a more objective level, if you like, transform, which it did in the end? That's the remarkable thing, the cultural or philosophical scene as such. So that's important, but that's not all. An intellectual is not just a speaker. Is not just a rhetorician, if you like, a narrator in the Latin sense. And when I came to Gramsci, I did as much as I could to explain that this kind of political, worldly philosopher was, well, in the prison, he had very few possibilities to speak. He was speaking, perhaps, but he was writing and thinking and theorizing in the hope that it would make a difference at some point. And so that's something. And then your first question, so that takes us back to the idea that the intellectual engagé, of which Sartre is an example, is not a general figure. And I'm tempted myself to say yes, of course. After trying to give it a kind of universal meaning and relevance, perhaps I should do well to return to the very specific historical aspects of this figure in the middle of the 20th century in Europe, and I would agree that this is the conditions are so different today that there are some so that sometimes I'm desperate of that, because I believe that the new modes of communication make all this, in a sense, completely obsolete, you know, and I don't know how intellectual engagé will do with the internet what others had done with books and etc. and so on. So you are absolutely right. We need to historicize, and Foucault is a good guide for that. To Neni, I already interrupted her. I would just add the following remark. Even if we are not as simplistic or blunt as that, and again, C.L.R. James' description, taken out of context, I would say, seems to push in that direction. We're almost tempted to explain that the bourgeois intellectuals rallying a progressive cause, qua traitors precisely, are embedded in difficult subjective issues, and therefore, and from there to the idea that they are the only ones who have a subjectivity, there would be no long. And from the, and as if the worldly intellectual is not a subject. No, I completely reject that. I mean, I don't say the self it is clear that that Sartre's question is something like, how can I be a bourgeois and at the same time, or for a certain deep necessity, not only side with the oppressed, but do something from within their or with their movement. And so the question becomes, am I still a bourgeois or am I not a bourgeois? So, and Hugo, etc., comes in. So I'm not saying that Gramsci is asking himself the same kind of question. Or Fanon, but I will never believe that Gramsci and Fanon have no subjective problems with their own action. And finally, Giacomo, you touch what, in a sense, is my main preoccupation or perhaps even obsession today, because I see fascism on the rise. And I ask myself, who is going to become a fascist? And of course, as I remember what I know of the history of Europe and also America in the 20th century, I perhaps have a dangerous tendency to be especially focusing and perhaps there's kind of fascination with the cases of people who brutally switched from an extreme to the other. A very interesting book published long ago by Jean-Pierre Faye, which is not Emmanuel Faye, by Jean-Pierre Faye on discourse and discourse analysis in Germany in the interwar period. He proposed the diagram of the horseshoe. So at the two extremes are not at the two ends of a line, very far from one another. They're extremely close to one another because the ideological spectrum is like a horseshoe. And at this place, brutal lightnings take place and people can shift very rapidly from one side to another. This is what we observe again, not only in the so-called brown-red tendency, etc., but on such specific questions as national sovereignty in the European left today. And again, I don't want to be too quick. It's like the people, it's like the category of the people could say the same with sovereignty or perhaps etc. I'm not just saying, oh, this is extremely bad. Let's as soon as we adopt this terminology, will be. But nevertheless, the phenomenon is there. Now, this being said, perhaps I'm too. Yeah, as with the kind of background I have intellectually and historically, perhaps I'm too much focused on that. And what you described in terms of another opposition between the tendency of the right in the 20s and 30s to adopt an aesthetic language and the left a more political language, of course, this is true. I completely agree with you.
Mm. Thank you, Étienne. Thank you so much. This has been such a rich conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for your interventions and comments and questions and the conversation. I think the term I will retain that I loved so much, Étienne, in your intervention is the ultra optimism of the will. So let's end on that note. On the note of the ultra optimism of the will. And I want to thank you, Étienne, dearly for joining us.
I thank you all. I thank you, Bernard, and I thank you
everyone who's here on the line. Thank you, Fonda. For
good luck for the next sessions.
And the next one will be November 10th with Kianga Yamata-Taylor on the Combahee River Collective Statement. So I hope you all will join us for that on November 10th. Thank you, Étienne, and thank you, everyone. See you soon.